smitten with a frenzy, and his wit and reason withdrawn. That is how an English chronicle of the time described what happened to the King of England in the late summer of 1453. He was 31. He had been the most powerful man in his kingdom, and one morning he simply stopped. He could not speak, he could not stand, he could not lift his own head. Attendants had to prop it for him. For roughly 18 months, the King of England sat in a chair like a dropped puppet, while a kingdom waited for him to come back. In the middle of that winter, his wife brought their newborn son into the room and held the baby up to his face. She needed one thing from him: a look, a blessing, some sign that the father recognized his heir. The king gave no response but a single glance, and then his eyes slid away. The woman holding that child was about 23 years old. Her name was Margaret of Anjou, and within a few years, half of England would be calling her a monster. This is the story of how a teenage bride became the most hated queen in English history, and why so much of what survives about her was written by the people who beat her. Everything in it comes from people who were in the room or from the paper they left behind. The private letters of a family living through the war, the register of a monk who watched the armies arrive in his own town, the dispatches of foreign ambassadors taking notes on a court they didn't trust. So 3 questions sit underneath all of it. How does a girl shipped to England to buy peace end up commanding its bloodiest war? How can a man who cannot recognize his own son still be king, and who actually runs a kingdom when the king goes silent? And why, 5 centuries later, are serious historians quietly tearing up the verdict her enemies wrote? Start with the deal that brought her here, because the deal is the whole tragedy in miniature. In 1444, England was losing. The long war with France, the war that an earlier English king had nearly won at Agincourt, was bleeding out. English commanders wanted a truce. The French would give one on a condition: a marriage. Charles VII of France would supply a bride, and in exchange the fighting would stop. The bride was Margaret. She was 14. Her father, René of Anjou, carried the titles of 3 kingdoms: Naples, Sicily, Jerusalem, and actually ruled almost none of them. He was a king on parchment and broke in practice. He offered only a token dowry, 20,000 francs, and never actually paid it. So England didn't merely take a bride with no real dowry. England paid for the privilege, because the expedition to fetch her across the Channel cost more than that dowry was ever worth. That alone would have made her unpopular, but there was a clause in the agreement that nobody in England was meant to read. In exchange for the marriage, the English side had secretly agreed to hand the province of Maine back to France. Maine was English-held ground, strategic, garrisoned, soaked in the blood of the men who had taken it. The men who governed it had not been consulted. So picture the optics. A penniless French girl arrives. The king pays for her. And within a few years, a slice of hard-won English France is quietly signed away as part of the package. When the secret leaked, the fury did not land on the king. It landed on her, and on the minister who had brokered it, the Earl of Suffolk, who was impeached, banished, and then, in 1450, dragged off a ship and beheaded over the side of a boat. The loss of Maine helped trigger an open popular revolt in the south of England that same summer. She had been in the country 5 years. One of the 2 men who built her marriage was already dead, killed by his own side. But the woman everyone would blame had walked into all of this holding almost no cards. And the role she'd been handed was never built for a fight. A medieval queen wasn't there to rule. She was there to soften, to intercede, to plead for mercy, to talk a king down from a bad decision. That was the whole job. And it worked exactly as long as there was a king who could be talked to. There is a version of Margaret that most people have met without realizing it. About a century and a half after she died, a playwright reached for her as a stock villain. In Shakespeare's telling, she is the she-wolf of France, scheming, ferocious, the foreign woman who unmans a gentle king and drowns a country in blood. It's vivid. It's quotable. It became the template for the manipulative queen in everything that came after. And here is what that famous version leaves out. For the first 8 years of her marriage, Margaret did precisely what a 15th century queen was supposed to do. She interceded. She softened quarrels. She wrote letters asking for mercy and for favours on behalf of others. She produced no child for 8 long years, which in her world was its own quiet failure, and she absorbed that too. The she-wolf does not appear anywhere in the record until the system that was meant to protect her broke. And the day it broke is the day the king stopped speaking. Think of the medieval English crown the way you'd think about a company built entirely around one founder. The king is not a figurehead, he is the executive. Justice runs in his name, money moves on his seal. Every great lord's power flows from standing close to him. There is no deputy structure, no clean procedure for what happens if the man at the centre stops functioning. The whole institution rests on a single assumption, that he can. In July 1453, an English army was destroyed at Castillon in the south of France. It was the last real battle of a war that had run for 100 years, and it meant England had lost nearly everything on the continent. Weeks later, on a judicial tour, resting at a hunting lodge in Wiltshire, the king collapsed into the catatonic silence we opened with. In modern terms, this was a company whose only executive had become permanently unreachable overnight. No succession plan, a contested heir, and a board full of directors who each wanted the chair. And the timing was almost unbelievable, because 3 months into the king's silence, Margaret gave birth to a son. After 8 childless years, the heir England had waited for finally arrived, and the one man on earth who needed to acknowledge him couldn't. That is the scene we started with, the Queen lifting the baby up, the King looking through him. The heir to the throne of England was, in the eyes of the law, a child his own father had never knowingly seen. So what was actually wrong with the King? We will never know for certain, and the honest version of this story has to say so. The people around him called it a frenzy. Modern psychiatrists, working from what the record describes, total withdrawal, muteness, the inability to move, then a near-complete recovery, have proposed catatonic schizophrenia or a severe depressive collapse. There is a darker symmetry too. The king's own grandfather was Charles VI of France, the man history remembers as the Mad. Whether anything was inherited is genuinely disputed. Charles raged and hallucinated and turned violent. His grandson went silent and still. Careful historians line up on both sides, and neither can prove it. Into that vacuum, 2 readings of one baby went to war. To Margaret, the child was the legitimate heir and her entire reason to fight. To her enemies, the suspiciously timed pregnancy of a king who was barely present became a weapon. The whispered claim that the boy was not really the king's son. There was no evidence for it. There didn't need to be. It was useful. So who runs the company when the founder can't? Margaret's answer was direct. She should. She was the queen, the mother of the heir, the obvious guardian of his interests. According to a newsletter that circulated among the Paston family early in 1454, she drew up a bill demanding what amounted to the whole rule of the land, the power to appoint the great officers, to govern in the king's place. The Lords said no, not because the plan was unworkable, because she was a woman and a French one. England would not give the regency to her. Instead, the council turned to the most powerful man with a claim to be there, Richard, Duke of York. York was made protector. He was also by blood next in line to the throne if the king's infant were ever set aside, which made him, from where Margaret sat, less a caretaker than a rival who had just been handed the keys. Translated out of the 15th century, the founder is incapacitated. His wife asks the board to let her run things until their infant son is old enough to inherit. The board refuses her on principle and installs the one director who personally stands to take everything if the baby is removed. You do not have to like Margaret to see why she stopped playing the gracious queen. And what she did next has been argued over for 500 years. Around Christmas of 1454, the king woke up. Just like that, the frenzy lifted. He was shown his son, asked the boy's name, and gave thanks to God. A recovery so abrupt that it was later remembered as something close to a miracle. But a king who could switch off without warning was a permanent emergency, and the struggle over who really held power did not switch off with him. In May 1455, it broke into open blood at St. Albans. John Whethamstede, abbot of the great monastery in that town, who watched it from inside his own walls, wrote down the dead lying in the streets. By the standards of what came later, it was a brawl. But it was the first blood of what we now call the Wars of the Roses. The fight over who governed for a broken king had become a fight to the death. And here is where Margaret became her legend. She stopped interceding and started commanding. She built a base of support, raised men, gathered the loyal lords around her son's claim, and turned the Lancastrian cause into his cause. Foreign envoys began writing home about her as the real force in the English court. A Milanese ambassador's dispatches treat the queen, not the king, as the figure to watch. She was doing, in open daylight, exactly what every great lord around her was doing in the shadows. And because she was a woman doing it, it read as something unnatural. There was even a staged peace. In 1458, the rival factions were marched, hand in hand, into a public procession of reconciliation. A piece of political theatre so brittle that within 2 years the country was at war again. You don't perform a reconciliation that elaborate unless everyone already knows it's fake. Then the war metastasized. Over the next 6 years, the great families of England tore one another apart. At the end of 1460, at Wakefield, the Duke of York himself was killed, and his severed head was mounted over a gate of the city of York, wearing a paper crown. A mockery that contemporaries pinned, fairly or not, on Margaret's side. Then came Towton, fought in a snowstorm in March 1461. By the count the heralds gave afterward, it was one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil. The dead numbered in the tens of thousands. A figure later writers may well have inflated, but every account agrees the slaughter was enormous. And after Towton, it looked finished. The Lancastrians were shattered. York's eldest son was crowned King Edward IV. Margaret's husband became first a fugitive, then a prisoner. Margaret herself fled with her young son, to Scotland, then to France, stripped of a crown, living as an exile on the charity of relatives. The heir she had fought for was a boy in borrowed rooms in another country. That is exactly where the story should end. A defeated queen, a deposed king, a dynasty over. Except Margaret did something almost no one in her position ever managed. She came back. In 1470, the man who had put Edward IV on the throne, the Earl of Warwick, the so-called kingmaker, fell out with the king he had made. And the only path open to Warwick was to ally with the woman he had spent a decade trying to crush. Brokered by the King of France, the two bitterest enemies in England shook hands. To seal it, Margaret's teenage son was married to Warwick's daughter. And for a few astonishing months it worked. Warwick drove Edward out of the country, pulled the broken old king out of the tower, and set him back on his throne. Margaret's husband was king again. Her son was heir again. There was one more person whose fate would decide hers. Her son. Edward of Westminster, the same baby once lifted toward a blank-faced king, was now 17, and he was determined to fight for the throne he had been born to. It is 1471. Margaret and her son cross the Channel to join Warwick. They land at Weymouth on the 14th of April. That very same day, miles away, Warwick is killed in battle at Barnet. Their great ally is dead before they can even reach him. She wants to turn back. Her son refuses. So they march. They try to push into Wales to gather more men. The Yorkists cut them off at a town called Tewkesbury. On the 4th of May, 1471, the Lancastrian army is broken. And somewhere in the rout, Edward of Westminster, 17 years old, the entire point of everything his mother had done for 18 years, is killed. The dynasty died with him in a single afternoon. The rest came fast. Margaret was captured. Within weeks, her husband, the gentle, ruined king, was dead in the Tower of London, almost certainly murdered, because now that there was no heir left to fight over, there was no reason to keep him alive. The one thing that had kept that fragile man breathing had died at Tewkesbury with his son. Margaret became a prisoner. The Yorkists placed her in the keeping of the Duchess of Suffolk, widow of the very minister who had been killed for arranging her marriage, and, by a strange thread, a granddaughter of the poet Chaucer. She lived like that for 4 years. Then, in 1475, the King of France ransomed her, but he made her pay for it. To go home, she had to renounce every inheritance she had from her own mother and father. She returned to France not as a queen but as a poor relation, dependent on a king who had bought her like a settled debt. She died there in 1482, in a modest house in the Loire Valley near Saumur, about 52 years old, with almost nothing to her name. And then the verdict writing began. The people who won wrote the chronicles. A foreign queen who had controlled a saintly king and caused a war made a perfect villain, and the story held. A century later, Shakespeare set it in art, the she-wolf, and for 400 years that was Margaret of Anjou. Ambition in a gown, the woman who broke England. Then historians went back to the documents she herself left behind, and a different woman came into focus. Her own letters are administrative, careful, conventional, the correspondence of someone managing estates and households and petitions, not a fury. For 8 years she behaved precisely as a queen was meant to. She reached for power only after the institution she belonged to collapsed, refused her the regency because of her sex, and handed control to the one man whose interests ran directly against her child's. Read that way, and modern scholarship increasingly does read it that way, Margaret did not break the rules out of hunger for power. She broke them because the rules had already failed her, and a defenseless boy was the only thing she had left to defend. Bring the shape into the present, and it's instantly familiar. The person at the center of an institution becomes incapable. The people around the spouse decide she can't be trusted to act in the family's interest, so they hand control to a rival, and then act surprised when she fights for her child's stake. We have plain words for a struggle like that: a contested succession, a boardroom fight over an incapacitated principal, a hostile bid for control. Margaret was running one of those, at the highest stakes there are, with no legal standing and a son to protect. The story we keep retelling is the one her enemies needed, a monster who wanted power. The record tells a smaller and harder one. A 15-year-old, sold for a piece that failed, married to a man who could disappear inside his own mind, who spent the rest of her life trying to make a kingdom recognize her son. She never managed it. The boy died uncrowned, the way he had very nearly begun, held up toward a face that would not look back. It took 500 years for anyone to look at her clearly.